Pak Chong, Thailand, summer 1971. A rural production outpost hours from Bangkok, humid heat pressing down on a small film crew who had traveled far from any studio comfort to shoot a low-budget picture almost no one in the industry expected to matter very much. This is the story of a single afternoon on that set, when a struggling production, and the career of the man standing at its center, quietly turned a corner that neither the studio nor the crew fully understood they were watching happen in real time. Bruce Lee arrived in Thailand that summer carrying more uncertainty than his calm, composed presence ever let on. He was 30 years old. He had spent over a decade in America chasing leading roles that studios kept handing to other men, had absorbed one polite rejection after another, and had finally accepted an offer from a small, newly formed Hong Kong production company willing to do what no American studio had ever been willing to do, build a picture entirely around him. The company was young, underfunded, largely unproven. The film was called The Big Boss, and almost nobody involved in making it, including Bruce himself in his more uncertain moments, was fully convinced it would amount to much of anything. The location itself did little to inspire confidence. Pak Chong was hours from Bangkok by a road that turned to red dust in the dry season and thick mud whenever it rained, which that summer felt like most days. The production housing was modest, the crew smaller than Bruce had grown used to on American sets, the budget tight enough that scenes were sometimes reshot fewer times than a perfectionist would have liked, simply because there wasn't film stock to spare. Bruce, by his own private admission to a friend who visited briefly during filming, wondered more than once during those first weeks whether he'd made a mistake leaving America for this, whether he'd traded one form of uncertainty for another, simply dressed differently, on the other side of the Pacific. The producer behind the company, a sharp, soft-spoken man who had staked a considerable portion of his young studio's future on Bruce specifically, believed in him in a way few American executives ever had. He'd met Bruce only briefly before offering him the role, largely on the strength of a reputation that had traveled faster through martial arts circles than through the film industry itself, and he'd taken a real financial risk, building an entire production around an actor with no significant leading credits to his name anywhere in the world. But belief alone didn't guarantee the film would work, and both men understood, in their more honest moments together, over quiet dinners after long days of shooting, that a great deal was riding on a production, neither of them fully controlled yet, in the ways that mattered most. The producer had bet his studio's early reputation on an instinct. Bruce had bet over a decade of accumulated frustration on the same instinct, from the opposite side of the camera. Neither man said so directly, but both understood exactly how much the other stood to lose if that instinct turned out to be wrong. The production had already stumbled once, before Bruce's biggest scenes were even shot. The original director, a man with a long career directing more conventional Hong Kong dramas, had built the film's fight sequences the way fight sequences had traditionally been built in the genre up to that point: wide, theatrical, deliberately paced, more concerned with recognizable choreography than with anything resembling the speed and impact audiences would later come to associate entirely with Bruce Lee's name. Early footage reportedly left everyone involved a little deflated. The producer watched dailies that looked competent, professional, and almost entirely unremarkable. Nothing that distinguished this small regional picture from a dozen others being made that same year on similarly modest budgets throughout the region. Bruce watched those early cuts with a kind of quiet, controlled frustration that people on set would later describe carefully, aware even then that they were watching a man holding himself back from saying everything he actually thought. He didn't storm off the set. He didn't demand changes loudly, in front of the crew, in ways that might have embarrassed the director in front of the people working under him. What he did, instead, according to those who were there, was request quiet conversations again and again, patiently laying out an argument he'd apparently been developing for years without ever having the leverage to actually test it on camera. Speed mattered more than scale, A strike thrown with real, focused intention read more powerfully on film than a wider, more theatrical motion ever could, even if the wider motion looked more impressive frozen in a single still photograph. Authenticity, he argued, would translate to an audience in ways that choreography alone never fully could, no matter how technically accomplished the choreography happened to be. The original director wasn't entirely convinced, at least not right away. There was, by several accounts, real tension on set during those early weeks, not the dramatic, screaming kind of conflict people sometimes imagine when they picture creative disagreements on a film set, but something quieter and in some ways more exhausting, a slow accumulation of small disagreements about pacing, about camera placement, about how long to hold a shot before cutting away from it. Bruce, increasingly, began pushing to choreograph his own sequences directly, to design the fights the way he understood fighting to actually work, rather than the way Hong Kong cinema had traditionally staged it for decades. It wasn't an easy case to make. He was, after all, a first-time leading man on a modest regional production, arguing with a far more experienced director about creative choices that weren't technically his to make. There was a cameraman on that production, a veteran of dozens of similarly modest pictures, who later admitted he'd spent those first weeks privately, convinced Bruce was going to be difficult to work with in the way ambitious young actors sometimes are full of opinions about a craft they hadn't yet proven they understood, as well as the people who'd been doing it for 20 years. He remembered watching Bruce request another quiet conversation with the director, the third or fourth that week, and thinking, without much sympathy, that the young star ought to simply trust the professionals around him and let the film get made the way films in that genre had always gotten made. It wasn't malice. It was just the ordinary, understandable skepticism of someone who had seen plenty of confident newcomers turn out to be wrong about exactly the things they were most confident about. What eventually shifted the balance wasn't an argument at all. It was a single afternoon of shooting, deep into production, centered on a sequence that would take place in and around a sawmill, the film's climactic confrontation. The sequence, everything else in the picture had been quietly building toward. Whether anyone involved fully recognized that yet or not, the night before that sequence was scheduled to shoot, Bruce reportedly stayed up late in his cramped production housing, working through the choreography almost obsessively, sketching movement in the margins of a notebook, the way he'd sketched movement his entire adult life, refining a sequence he'd apparently already rehearsed alone, repeatedly, in whatever open space he could find near the set. During breaks, other crew members spent resting from the heat. He wasn't simply memorizing steps. He was building an argument, one he intended to make with his body instead of his voice, because his voice, by that point in the production, had already made its case as clearly as it was going to. A production assistant who passed his room late that night remembered seeing the light still on well past midnight, and hearing, faintly through the thin wall, the soft, repeated sound of bare feet shifting across a wooden floor, not loud enough to be a full rehearsal, just quiet enough to be a man running the same handful of movements over and over in his head as much as with his body, the way a musician might silently finger the notes of a difficult passage lying awake in bed. In the morning, Bruce looked, by most accounts, no more rested than anyone else on that production. But there was a particular focus in his eyes that several crew members noticed and later remembered specifically, the kind of stillness that comes right before, rather than after, something significant. He ate almost nothing that morning, according to the same assistant, waving off breakfast with the distracted courtesy of a man whose attention had already, in every meaningful sense, left the room. He spent nearly an hour alone near the tree line at the edge of the property before call time, moving through the sequence one final time, without an audience, the way he'd practiced everything important his entire life, first in private, exhaustively, until the movement belonged to him so completely that performing it for other people finally became simple. The morning of the shoot, the air around the set carried a different kind of tension than the arguments of the previous weeks. Less friction, more anticipation, the specific quiet that settles over a crew when everyone's senses, without quite being able to name it yet, that something is about to be decided. Bruce moved through rehearsal with an intensity that several crew members later described as different from anything they'd seen from him during the earlier weeks of filming. Not performing for the camera yet, simply working, silently, repeatedly, running the same sequence of movements over and over until his body could execute it without his mind needing to intervene at all. When the cameras finally rolled, what happened in front of them was, by every account from people who were actually there that day, unlike anything most of the crew had witnessed in years of working in the regional film industry. The speed was the first thing anyone noticed. Strikes that seemed to arrive before the body had visibly wound up to throw them, footwork that carried Bruce across the frame with an efficiency that made the traditional, wider choreography of earlier scenes look, by comparison, almost quaint. But it wasn't only speed. It was the specific, coiled intensity Bruce brought to every single beat of the sequence, an intention that read clearly through the camera in a way that raw technical skill alone couldn't have accounted for. Between takes, crew members who had spent weeks quietly skeptical of the arguments Bruce had been making found themselves, almost without meaning to, gathering closer to the monitor to watch the footage played back. That same veteran cameraman, the one who'd spent weeks privately doubting the young star's confidence, later described watching the first playback of the sequence through his viewfinder and feeling something shift in his own understanding, almost physically, like a held breath finally releasing. He said he'd filmed hundreds of fight sequences by that point in his career, competent ones, professional ones, sequences that satisfied an audience without ever really surprising them. He said he had never, before that afternoon, filmed anything that made him forget, even briefly, that he was supposed to be watching through a lens, instead of simply watching. He didn't apologize to Bruce for his earlier skepticism. Not directly, that wasn't really how things worked on a set like that one. But he adjusted his own camera placement more aggressively for every sequence that followed, chasing angles that could capture what he now understood needed capturing. And years later, when asked about the film in interviews, he always mentioned that particular afternoon first, before anything else. The original director, watching the same replay, reportedly said very little in the moment, no dramatic concession, no immediate reversal of the disagreements that had shaped the previous weeks. But something in the working relationship shifted from that day forward. Bruce was given increasingly wide latitude over the choreography of every sequence that followed. Nobody needed to formally announce the change. The footage itself had already made the argument Bruce had spent weeks failing to win through conversation alone. Word of what had been shot that day traveled through the small production faster than any formal announcement could have. By the time the crew broke for the evening, there was a different energy across the set, entirely the specific, electric feeling of people who suspect, without yet being able to prove it, that they've just been part of something considerably bigger than the modest, low-budget picture they'd signed on to make. The producer, watching the same footage that night, reportedly stopped worrying, at least for a while, about the film's uncertain commercial prospects. Whatever else the big boss turned out to be, he now understood he had captured something on film that audiences had never quite seen presented this way before. On the night of its Hong Kong premiere, months later, Bruce reportedly stood at the back of the theater rather than in a seat near the front, watching the audience instead of the screen, a habit, those close to him said, that stayed with him for the rest of his career, because he trusted a room full of strangers reacting in real time, far more than he trusted any single executive's prediction about what an audience would or wouldn't respond to. He watched people lean forward during the Sawmill sequence, the same way the crew had leaned toward the monitor months earlier in the Thai heat. He watched them gasp, watched them go quiet in the specific way crowds go quiet when they're genuinely surprised rather than simply entertained. By the time the credits rolled, he already knew, before any box office figures existed to confirm it, that the afternoon at the Sawmill had translated exactly the way he'd always privately believed it would. When the film was finally released in Hong Kong later that year, it didn't simply perform well. It broke box office records that had stood in the territory for years, records set by far bigger, far more expensively produced pictures from far more established studios, Lines stretched around city blocks. Theaters added additional screenings to accommodate crowds that refused to thin out even after weeks of the film already playing. The small, underfunded production that almost nobody in the industry had expected to matter became, almost overnight, one of the most successful films the Hong Kong industry had ever released, and the uncertain 30-year-old actor at its center became, with a speed that startled even the people who had always believed in him, the biggest movie star in the region. What almost nobody outside that small production crew ever fully understood was how much of that success traced back to a single afternoon at a rural sawmill set, when a man who had spent over a decade being told, patiently and repeatedly, that his instincts about how action should look on screen simply weren't commercially viable, finally got the chance to prove otherwise with his body, instead of his voice, in front of a camera that couldn't argue back the way executives and directors always had. Bruce rarely spoke afterward about the tension of those earlier weeks, the quiet arguments, the moments of doubt that came with pushing so hard against a more experienced director's instincts on his very first leading role. What he talked about, when he talked about that period at all, was simpler than that, and in its own way more revealing. He said that he'd always believed real martial arts, filmed honestly, without unnecessary theatrical padding, would eventually find an audience willing to recognize it for what it was. The Big Boss, and that one afternoon at the Sawmill in particular, had simply been the first time anyone had given him the chance to actually test that belief in front of a camera, rather than simply argue for it in a room full of people who had already made up their minds without him. He would go on, over the following 2 years, to make the films that eventually made him the most recognized martial artist in the history of cinema, films built on the same principles he'd fought quietly, patiently, and almost entirely without credit to establish on that first modest production in rural Thailand. But those who worked alongside him on The Big Boss, the ones who remembered the tension of those early weeks and the specific, charged quiet that settled over the set the afternoon everything changed, always considered that Sawmill sequence the real beginning not of his fame, which came later and faster than anyone could have reasonably predicted, but of the simple, hard-won confirmation that what he'd believed about his own instincts for years, against considerable and reasonable-sounding doubt, had been true the entire time. Years later, that same veteran cameraman, by then something of a respected figure in his own right within the industry, was asked in an interview what he considered the most important lesson he'd taken from his long career behind a camera. He didn't mention any of the larger, more celebrated productions he'd gone on to work on in the decades that followed. He mentioned Pak Chong, The Mud, The Heat, and a 30-year-old actor who had spent weeks patiently, respectfully, almost apologetically arguing for an idea nobody around him had been willing to fully trust yet, and who had finally, when the argument alone wasn't enough, simply stepped in front of the camera and proven it instead. He said the lesson wasn't really about martial arts or filmmaking or even about Bruce Lee specifically. It was simpler than that, and in its own way harder to apply consistently. Sometimes the only way to be believed is to stop asking people to believe you and let them watch instead.